Thank you, everybody, for joining us. This is the first event of this academic year. It's been 2 years since we have been doing these kinds of Zoom webinars. We had moved from in-person to Zoom webinars due to the pandemic, and we look forward to going back to in-person events. But the Zoom webinars has really helped us connect to many people around the world. And today, about 180 people registered from all over the world for this event. I see about 70 people who have already joined us. So this Zoom webinars has been a good way of linking with people all around the world. And I hope many of you will join us in the subsequent talks that we'll have, beginning with today's talk by Professor Xin Fan. I think many of you attending this webinar know about his work. Professor Xin Fan, who is from SUNY in New York, he is actually joining us from Cambridge in the UK. He is currently Associate Professor of History at SUNY Fredonia, but because of his research and his family, he is now in UK at Cambridge. Professor Xin Fan is an important scholar of Chinese historiography, which you'll see in today's talk. His book, World History and National Identity in China, the 20th Century, is a major work in understanding the connection between Chinese academia and the building of nationalism in China in the 20th century. And then this book was published last year in 2021. He has given some talks on the book, but it's really a pleasure that he is sharing his thoughts with us today. But he is also working on another very, very interesting topic, the title of which is The Right to Talk About China, Liberal Intellectuals and the Rise of Emotional Politics, 1900 to 1949. He is now currently based, as I said, in Cambridge. He will be teaching at the Faculty of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies at Cambridge University. And he is now the fellow-elect and the director of studies at Lucy Cavendish College at the university. We hope, Xin Fan, at some point you can come and visit Shanghai and meet us in person. So without further ado, I'll ask you to give a talk for about 40-45 minutes, and then we'll have Q&A. So those in the audience, you'll see at the bottom of your screen a Q&A box where you can post your questions as Xin Fan is giving his talk, or wait until he has finished his talk and type in your question. I'll moderate the Q&A for you. So that Q&A session will last about 40 minutes as well. So please join me in welcoming Professor Xin Fan.
Let me just turn on the PowerPoint. Thank you very much for Professor Han Sen-sen's nice introduction. Before my talk, I'd like to say a few words. That is, I published this book, World History and the National Identity in China, the 20th Century, last year with Cambridge University Press. And after that, the reception of the book in the field has been warm. A couple of scholars, including Peter Zhao, Vincent Lun, Ren Ke, has written nice reviews for the Journal of Chinese History, 20th Century China, and Global Intellectual History. And I was also invited to give talks about this book at different places in the world, including the universities in Britain, Germany, United States, and China. But I would like to say today's presentation, today's talk is not just another book talk for two reasons. One is in 2017, I spent a semester, a summer in Shanghai. And here I was invited by a scholar based at NYU Shanghai to give a talk. What that talk was based on a chapter in this book project. So I guess the first presentation about this book project that I gave was actually at NYU Shanghai. In a way, today's talk is my second one. It's homecoming. I feel this is like at home. And the second thing here is I just mentioned to Tencent and my colleagues in Shanghai that is today's world has been separated by the COVID-19, the pandemic, and the interaction between scholars inside China and outside the world has been challenging. Me as a Chinese national, I was unable to return to China to visit my homeland for more than 2 years. And the scholars in NYU Shanghai, I believe they have this special privilege that they are still able to keep the dialogue and the conversation between China and the outside world going on. So they know better about China than us today. And in that case, I would really appreciate this opportunity to learn more from scholars who are based in NYU Shanghai, because this is an opportunity not just for me to introduce my book, but also for me to learn. And here, I guess this is a little short introduction about today's presentation. I try to contextualize a little bit, but let me return to the book. Today, I'm going to talk about the book, World History and the National Identity in China. But because of the special audience that is better informed about China, I would like to focus on the historiographical part. In other words, I would like to talk about the writing of a world history a little bit more in today's conversation. And one central argument I would like to make is a lot of people in China in the past, they assumed that world history in China is outdated or backward, either way. So it has been left behind by their counterparts in other parts of the world. So a lot of people in China, especially world historians, they say, we have to learn from the other people, we have to learn from the scholars in the West, because we need to improve. And that's a good mentality. I like the sort of humbleness among world historians in China. But the central argument I would like to make in today's talk is, well, if we compare world history in China to its counterparts in other parts of the world, it is really difficult to make an argument that world history in China was or is left much behind by their counterparts. So for example, let me start with this document. This is a survey done in the 1930s by historian Lei Haizong. At that time, he was in charge of the history department at the Tsinghua University. He himself taught world history in China. And he is considered as one of the great names of world historical studies in Chinese historiography. And he did this survey in the 1930s. And according to this survey, that the students at the best universities, the top universities in China in the 1930s, they had at least equal amount of courses related to world history than their counterparts among elite universities in the United States. In fact, for upper level courses, the university, like the elite Chinese universities like Beijing University, actually offered more courses that are related to world history than Chicago or Harvard did. And this is something that we have to think about. That is, when we're talking about world history in China, we're not really just looking at a field that is trying to catch up with the outside world. It is a field that is a long history, that is deeply rooted in China's interaction with the world over the course of the 20th century. So this is a central argument that I would like to make in today's presentation. And this presentation is roughly based on the chapters from my book. And according to the book, I would like to divide world history, the development of world history in China into 4 major stages. That is, in the beginning, it was late Qing period. During this time, you can see world history as a concept was developed in China among amateur writers. These were not world historians, not professional historians, but people who were interested in world history, and these were gentry scholars. So this is the first stage of a development, late 19th century, late Qing period. And the second period is the Republican period. At that time, a lot of scholars called world history as either foreign history or Xiyang, history of the West, Xiyangshi. And during this time, world history was included in China's national curriculum. And therefore, we could make this argument that world history in the Republican period in China had already developed into a teaching field. The rise of world history teaching in the Republican period. This is the second period. And the third period is the beginning of the People's Republic of China. This is a time due to certain debates among historians, especially among world historians, that world history gained another dimension. Not only was it responsible for teaching, now it was becoming a field of research. So here we're looking at the early 1950s, world history gained another dimension, that world history became a teaching field. And the last part, right, the last period that I'm going to talk about in today's conversation is after 1980s. You can see world history as a field of teaching and research gradually became more and more professionalized and specialized. And this is the last topic that I'm going to deal with. One more thing I would like to mention here is a caveat. That is, world history is an extremely complicated topic in China, because world history includes many things. And in order to control this very broad topic, my research is primarily looking at one subfield in world historical studies in China, which is ancient world history. In Chinese, we call that 世界古代史 or 世界上古史, ancient world history. I'm choosing this topic for a couple of reasons. One is ancient world history covers the history before the fall of the classical antiquity. And it is before the rise of Western modernity. So it is a small subject in the big field of ancient world history. It deals with one of the 3 parts of world history according to professional periodization in China. So ancient world history is the beginning part of world history, so it's a small field. The second reason I'm choosing this topic is ancient world historians in China were not only trying to connect China to the world, but also they were trying to connect the ancient past to modern society. In other words, in their work, they have to overcome the gap of both time and space in order to stress the question of identity in a modernizing society. So this makes us interesting. It is small, it is controllable, it is complicated, it is interesting. And this is the reason I'm choosing ancient world history as the focus in my research and in today's presentation. Ancient world history as example to look at the general development of world history in China over 100 years. Then let me just break down. Let me just go over these different periods in the book. And along with this process, I would like to highlight some interesting perspectives that are reflected from ancient world history, historical studies in China from the past. So first, let me talk about the beginning, world history writing in late Qing dynasty. As a historian, oftentimes we're dealing with some assumptions from the past, and we're trying to highlight what is new in our research project. And here in this chapter, I'm trying to challenge an assumption, but I'm not sure this assumption is already outdated among historians today. But I'm trying to argue that when we are looking at China, when we are looking at the question between tradition and modernity, are we really looking at a sharp gap? Are we really trying to say that China's tradition will make China isolated from the rest of the world? Is China's past, China's tradition, antithesis of global modernity? A lot of scholars have been doing this, I think, trying to challenge this dichotomy. In my own work, I'm looking at one case study. That is, in 1901, there is this history writer who was based in Shanghai. He didn't read anything other than Chinese. And he was writing only based on Chinese language sources, 1901. And he's not a professional historian. In fact, he was only a medical practitioner. So in other words, he was a doctor. As a doctor who did not read other languages. But this guy wrote ancient world history. And I thought that's quite interesting. And then I looked into it and I'm able to make a few interesting arguments. And these interesting arguments are potentially challenging this dichotomy between Chinese tradition and the global modernity. Let me talk about this a little bit more. So when we are looking at this person, you can see the photo here. This is the character we're looking at, whose name is Zhou Weihan, the medical doctor who wrote ancient world history based on Chinese sources in 1901, and perhaps is the first one in Chinese language written by a Chinese scholar of the time. Let me first introduce the book. What was he trying to write about? I say it's ancient world history because this book titled 西史纲目, or I translate as Outline of Western History, has two books. The first one called Chu Han Series 1, and the second one is called Er Han Series 2. Basically, it covers the world historical development all the way to the rise of Islam. So about the beginning of world civilizations. And in this book, he talks about ancient world history from other countries, but interesting enough that he's adopting traditional Chinese historiographical genre, 纲目体, to write about world history. You can see he lists you look at this image from the book, right? He adopts traditional Chinese calendar and use big characters to write down the year. For example, this is Zhou Huiwang. And then he introduced Christian calendar. This is Christian calendar. After that, he would put world events by list from one country to another. After that, he would make his comments, and he used 外史公 as his title, like 太史公 by Sima Qian. So in terms of genre, this is a combination of traditional historical writing with world historical information. It is a sort of a unique form of the time. But when we're reading more about the book, it is even more interesting because this person, Zhou Weihan, clearly he's a Confucian scholar. And in the past, when we were studying history in high school or at middle school, our teachers oftentimes told us that Confucianism was very much isolated from the rest of the world. Confucian scholars refuse to look at the world. But this is absolutely not the case because he's a Confucian scholar, but based on Confucianism, he was able to develop a certain sort of global visions. And here, let me explain some ideas that he had. For the book, 西史纲目, again, let's return to this book, 西史纲目. Zhou Weihan has a clear central argument. That is, we have the history of the West, and we have the history of China. There's West, there's China, there's East. However, fundamentally, this is all the same. Why? Because as human beings, we share common humanity. So this is the central argument the book is trying to make. And then Zhou Weihan adopted this idea of progressive history. He argues that history is moving forward. But then sometimes some countries like China or Egypt were not moving that fast. Why? Because stupid ideas. And he used the term superstitions, 迷信, to refer to these so-called stupid ideas. And that's quite interesting because it seems this is a common knowledge we know from 20th century that the world is moving forward, the society is progressing. But unlike a lot of modernizers or modernist historians, Zhou Weihan, as a Confucian scholar, he had a true belief in classical antiquity. And he believed that the human society is moving forward. However, there are two things that to be recognized. One is people are limited. Their views of the world can be very limited. So these limited views are leading to the rise of prejudice, 私见. And aside from 私见, there are universal principles, 公理. So the world, the knowledge system is like this. On the one hand, we have 公理, universal principles. But then with the progress of society, with the development of history, generations of people are adding prejudice, 私见, to the common, to the universal principles. And layers and layers and layers after is today. So the layers of 私见 is so thick that we're not able to recognize 公理, universal principles. And therefore, classical antiquity offers us the rare opportunity that we can jump over layers of 私见 and return to the beginning of 公理. So this is the important value of ancient history. And this argument sounds quite interesting because it helps a lot of scholars even today to connect the ancient past to modern society. And he does so through the views of Confucianism. And along with that, as a Confucian scholar, he argues the world is a very complicated place. And in fact, Confucianism in China is not really on the rise. In fact, it was on a decline. However, he believed that in the future, Confucianism would eventually triumph. Why? Because he compared Confucianism to the other ideological and religious system in the world. And he argued all the other ideological and religious systems were pretty much based on religion. Only Confucianism is based on humanism. And therefore, Confucianism eventually would triumph. And this interesting idea, I guess for today, we can just briefly introduce it for the sake of conversation. But what I'm trying to argue here is when we are looking at the early works of world history in China, it is very complex and is also illuminating because it helps us to understand the relationship between ancient past and modern society even better. Another argument I'm trying to make in this chapter that I'm not going to highlight in today's conversation is the social network, because I'm looking at this one book as a case study, 西式纲目, and my reader would naturally ask, right, how much this is a typical case, how much this is a very special case. Can you use this book to make a general argument? And what am I trying to do is to place this book, the production of the book, 西式纲目, with a wider network of intellectual connection and knowledge system. We can see that Zhou Weihan was writing this book, but he was not working alone. The people who are reading the book, people who are introducing the book, and the people who are helping him to write the book were connected in a very complicated social elite network that is based in Changzhou in the Yangtze Delta region. And the network is so extensive, eventually it reached all the way to Xu Zhimo, Lü Simian, and other famous individuals like Zhao Yuanren in the later years. So, in other words, when we are talking about this global visions embedded in this book, it's not just him. It is a social network of gentry elites who shared the idea of global visions in the late Qing period. So this is the first part of the book. And then the second part of the second chapter of the book, I'm dealing with the Republican period. And I would like to argue that in the Republican period, the central focus of world history in China was teaching. In other words, a lot of scholars who were involved in world history were primarily history teachers. And they also edited some really interesting textbooks on world history. And in this chapter, I'm dealing with three individuals. The beginning is Chen Hengzhe, who was the first female professor teaching at Peking University in 1917. And then I briefly talk about He Bingsong, who was another famous pioneer of world history teaching and textbook writing in the Republican period. And then I talk about Lei Haizong and his critique of Eurocentrism in his teaching and textbook editing of world history in the Republican period in China. Let me briefly introduce the first two. The early writing of world history as textbooks in China in the Republican period was dealing with a question about internationalism. In the early years, 1917, when Chen Hengzhe was teaching at Peking University, she was looking at the world through a contradiction. The tension between nationalism and, the tension between imperialism and internationalism. She recognized that the late 19th century was the high time of global imperialism. And she thought that the solution to this problem would be internationalism, that people around the world joining hand in hand to form international society to solve the problem by negotiation, by conferences, by talking, by collaboration, by solidarity. And so this is the early years of world history textbook writing in China, which is reflected in the textbook that she published for commercial price. But a couple of years later, when He Bingsong talked about that, he also emphasized the contradiction in the world between two forces. But this time is not imperialism with internationalism. It is imperialism against nationalism. He Bing-sung started to promote nationalism as a tool to resist imperial aggression in China. And therefore, we can see the world historians in China gradually recognize the significant role of a nation state and nationalism in building up and mobilizing resources in China. And this has something to do with the global environment, because in the early in the 1910s and 1920s and the early 1930s, China witnessed a very different global environments. The Japanese aggression in China became more and more intense, and the Chinese historians were worried. And by the time of late 1930s, historian Lei Haizong started to embrace world history as a tool to mobilize, to promote national solidarity. And for him, nationalism was a way for China to survive. And therefore, China have to emphasize its own national identity. But of course, we can say in this process, we observe the rise of nationalism. But along with this process, early world history writers in the Republican period did produce some very interesting literature in criticizing Eurocentrism. And here, just allow me to give you one example. In 1936, if I remember the year correctly, I have to double check. Lei Haizong published a very interesting work. In it, he talked about world history as a concept. And he recognized that in China, during the time, which is the Republican period, there are three words to be used. One, it is referred to world history. The first one is 世界史. Literally, this is world history. 西洋史 and 外国史. 西洋 rather literally means the history of the West. 外国史 means the history of foreign countries. And he says all these three words are in general referring to world history in China. And then he argues that these terms are fundamentally Eurocentric, especially the term 西洋 and 东方. So here, let's see. 西洋 means the West. 东方 means the East. And he says when Western scholars use the West to refer certain areas in world history, it is confusing. Because if we consider the West as a geographical definition, then the West is confusing. Because when we are looking at Greece and Egypt, they're roughly in the same latitude, but one is being categorized as the West, and the other is categorized as the East. The term itself is problematic. And then he challenged the power structure behind this geographical definition. And then he moves from a spatial terms, 西洋 and 东方, the East and the West, to the temporal term like 上古. And basically he argued that 上古 is a concept that was based on Western experience, especially classical antiquity in Greece and Rome. But this term cannot be applied to other places in the world, like in China. So as historians, before we're engaging world history as a true global past, we have to challenge these concepts first. And I think for these ideas, they're developing in the early decades of, they're developing in the 1930s, but eventually they will become more and more outspoken in later years when we're talking about the 1950s. And the world historians in China during time, like Lei Haizong, also created their own agenda and own periodization of world history, rather based on Chinese historical experience. And here, there's a short example I list in the slide. But let me just move to the next one. The third chapter of the book is dealing with the founding of the field of teaching and research of world history in the early 1950s. As I mentioned, in the Republican period, world history was primarily a teaching field. And historians who were related to world history, they were primarily teachers, textbook editors, like historians like Li Haizong. He published a few articles about world history, but not necessarily was he able to produce monographs and do a rigorous research agenda in world history. But this changed in the 1950s. Why? This is because the Soviet influence, the founding of the People's Republic of China brought the idea world history becoming a field of teaching and research. In the 1950s, the Chinese government initiated a major restructuring of Chinese higher education system. And then they introduced the Soviet system, teaching and research unit system into China, and which in Chinese we call 教研式 system. Basically, that's a way to specialize the teaching and the research of knowledge under the higher education system. And for the first time, ancient world history, medieval world history, and the modern world history were established as three different research and teaching units. So three 教研式. Ancient world history, 世界上古史, medieval world history, 世界中古史, and the modern world history, 世界近现代史, were established as 教研式. And this is the big change that was issued by the state. And for the communist state, the agenda was very clear. That is, through institutionalization, the state was trying to totally control knowledge production. And the big social and political changes had a huge impact on individual experience. And in this chapter, chapter 3, I'm looking at 4 individuals. And this chapter is sort of like a collective biography. And these 4 individuals chose their own ways to cope with the social and the political changes. That is, how do you deal with the bigger issues in the system of knowledge production as an individual self? Some of them chose to embrace the change. They became individuals who were eager to embrace socialist ideology, to work with the new socialist teaching and research unit system. And some of them were trying to reject it, trying to preserve the way that they were familiar with and the way in which they believe their moral and cultural mission was. So they were rejecting the change. And for the people who were rejecting change, they suffer. And for the people who embraced the system, they flourished. So here we have 2 examples, the individuals that embraced the changes. One is Tong Shuye. The other is Lin Zhichun. And this is a general picture of the time. But what exactly happened to world history writing of the moment? And especially in the field of ancient world history. Because this 1950s is something that scholars have already studied in the past. The first book about world history in China that was published in the 1990s, the author made a very clear argument that in the 1950s, world history in China became a handmaiden of political ideology. is that true? That's something that I'm dealing with. This is something that I'm dealing with in the next chapter of the book, chapter 4. In this chapter, I focus on the historical writing among Marxist historians. And especially, I'm looking at the debate regarding the Asiatic mode of production. Let me just say a few words about the Asiatic mode of production. Socialism or communism in China was both a political effort and ideological enterprises. The communist state was trying to introduce a historical materialism and injected the historical materialism as the guiding ideology for historical writing. And one main issue is how do we explain the development of human society? In the 1950s, there was a clear agenda to do it. That is, according to Stalin from the Soviet Union, world history can be divided into 5 clear stages of development, from a primitive society to slave society, feudal society, capitalist society, eventually to communism. 5-stage development. It is very clear, right? It is, and this is the guiding ideology from the state. However, when we are looking at the ancient world history writing in the 1950s, the most interesting debate among historians of the time, which eventually gave rise to a very aggressive research agenda to promote the study of ancient world history, especially the ancient history of Mesopotamia, Egypt, and India, these non-Western country areas, took place within this debate about how human society developed. Because on the one hand, there's a clear agenda from Stalin, 5 stages. On the other hand, returning to the original words of Marx, he once referenced to another stage of development in the human past, which he called the Asiatic mode of production. So this becomes a problem. Where do you place Asiatic mode production within the 5 stages of development? Marx never gave a clear indicator. He never truly explained where this should belong to. And for a lot of people, they were arguing maybe Asiatic mode production should be one of those stages of development. Which stage? In the 1950s, 2 historians, Lin Zhichun and Tong Shuye, both of them were eager to embrace political ideology and Marxism. Both of them were eager learners of historical materialism, and both of them were eager to introduce scholarship from the Soviet Union to China. But they have different opinions. And one of them argued that AMP, Asiatic mode production, should belong to the stage of slavery. And the other were shifting his opinion. One time he was arguing that Asiatic mode production should be part of a primitive society. And once he argued, well, maybe it should be part of the feudal society. And this debate was developing very, very fast and mobilized the scholars from the entire field. Of course, this has become quite boring for readers today because these debates oftentimes are evolved with very complicated Marxist jargons on historical materialism. So it's sort of boring, but the central argument trying to make is the debate itself is not just about political ideology. The debate is an issue among historians. who are trying to figure out an agenda for world historical development alternative to the orthodoxy from the Soviet Union. The Asiatic mode production as an idea is ambiguous, is vague, is complicated. But because its complexity, it is exactly because Marx did not explain this clearly, it created opportunity that allows historians in China to have the real excitement to debate, to have academic change. This seems a bit boring of the time, but in the next chapter, in the 1980s, we can see the debate of the Asiatic mode production eventually would be evolving into the next stage of historiographical argument among world historians in China. Eventually, they are going to use another non-Marxist term to replace the Asiatic mode of debate and introduce city-state as a concept to coin a new stage of global development in the ancient past. So that's something I'm going to talk about in the last chapter of the book. In this chapter, I'm dealing with the issue of a socialist legacy in the post-Mao era. And I'm looking at three major debates that took place among world historians, especially ancient world historians in China. The debate about the Asiatic mode production, the debate about the city-states, and the debate about labor-created man. And from late 1970s all the way to late 1990s, we can see that world historians, on the one hand, they were working with the concepts that were deeply rooted in the historiography from the 1950s. On the other hand, through debating, through exchanging ideas, they were gradually getting beyond these ideas. They were using the framework from the past, but create new and alternatives agenda. And eventually, they will introduce cultural nationalism to replace historical materialism for world historical studies in China. So for example, when we are looking at the historian Lin Zhichun, in the 1950s, he was very much involved in the debate of Asiatic mode production. But in the 1980s, he would promote the idea city-states. He would argue city-state is a shared stage of development in the ancient past in China, in the West, in the Middle East. And he looked at the ancient, the collectible records from Guo Yu and Zhu Shu Jinnian, and he argues the concept of Guo, the concept of Min, the concept of Wang, were very much similar to the concepts in other ancient regions in the ancient world. So in other words, China's past was never a separate path of development. In fact, China shared a similar trajectory with other parts of the world. And for him, this trajectory is, in the beginning, it was feudal city-states. Eventually, it became a unified global empire. So this is his argument, one example, but we can talk about more later if we will have time. But eventually, once the historians in China totally gave up on the terms that were originally from historical materialism, suddenly, somehow, they are struggling with what would be the unifying framework through which they could talk about the shared ideas. It seems the field is becoming more and more specialized, which is good, but more and more fragmented, which is not that good, by the time of late 1990s. And today I would argue that if we look at the overall development, it seems cultural nationalism has replaced this global identity among many world historians in China today. All right, so these are some very brief summaries of my chapters from the book. And today, I'm trying to focus on the writing of history. So in other words, I'm trying to highlight 3 important arguments if we are looking at the world history in China as a legacy from the 20th century. 3 things. One is, in China, historians, especially ancient world historians, are trying to reconcile the tension between the ancient past and modern society. In doing so, they have produced enormous amount of literature on this issue. From Zhou Weihan to Lin Zhichun, through Tong Shuye, we can see many of them were talking about how to connect the ancient past to modern society. That's one important legacy we have to face. And the second important legacy is when the historians in China are dealing with the history of the world, oftentimes they have to overcome the gap between the East and the West. And some of them were embracing the idea of global mentality based in common humanity. And others, they're trying to embrace historical materialism and looking at economic mode of production. Either way, these experiments offered us rich data sets and the lessons for us to rethink how to overcome the gap between the West and the East as a dichotomy. The third thing is, how do you write world history in China being a Chinese? And this is an issue that troubles many of them a lot. But over the past 100 years, you can see the people in China, some of them developed so much passion for the history of the world that they devoted their entire life to the cause of studying ancient world history. So for example, Lin Zhichun, that we talk about this socialist historian, right? Historian embraced socialism. And he loved the field so much that in the 1990s, he even spent his own salary sending his students to the West countries in order to pursue PhD degrees. And there's so much passion in it. And how do we recognize this? How do we recognize this legacy to bridge China and non-China, Chinese and non-Chinese? That's something that we have to learn from the legacy of world historical studies in China. I'm writing this as different stages of developments, from late Qing to Republican period to early PRC to 1980s and 1990s. It seems the development is uneven, and sometimes there are a lot of contingencies. But at the same time, we can also recognize this idea to embrace the world is like an undercurrent in Chinese intellectual thought. It is a genealogy that has to be more recognized by us today. So for example, Zhou Weihan is a people, the guy who wrote the world history in 1901 in China, right? Few people know about him in China today, because in the process of professionalization, his name was quickly forgotten. He was not a professional historian. His work was not really adopted by professional textbook publishers. So his name was forgotten. Really? Actually not. Because generations later, his grandson, Zhou Wenzhong, you can see the image here, actually became the first Chinese individual who became a music professor at Columbia University. And for his entire life, his work was to introduce classical music from China to the outside world. and bring back classical music from the world to China. And many of his students became foundational characters in music composing enterprises in the world today. So in other words, Zhou Weihan probably passed away, forgotten. But these efforts had to be recognized and have to be recognized by historians today, by his family, by the genealogy of thought, and by people like us. And I guess one lesson, maybe one takeaway I would like to briefly mention here is when I'm looking at ancient world history in China, I especially appreciate this long-term thinking. Today, we recognize there's a very vigorous effort conducted by global historians to embrace this idea, global history, to emphasize global connection, connectivity, connectedness in the world historical past. And this is a spatial dimension, which is a wonderful work. But at the same time, we also have to think about the long-term view of the past. Because here, we can see a world that was not dominated by the West. And in here, we can see a world that was not just about modernity. It is multicultural and multidimensional and truly fascinating. But only with a long-term view could we recognize the valuable lessons and the beautiful legacies from the ancient world. And that's something I would like to invite you to talk about and think about it with me together. Thank you very much for listening. And I would like to return to the questions and maybe we can have a conversation together. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Xin-Fan. And I see a number of questions already posted in the Q&A box. I would encourage others to type in their questions as well. Before I go ahead and moderate the questions from the audience, let me ask you a question. It's a twofold question. As you know, Xin-Fan, I've been interested in the other group of scholars who have been writing on the history of Sino-foreign interactions, right? Right? And also as a student of Chinese history, I've been looking at writing of Chinese history itself, right, by Chinese scholars. So the first part of my question is, are there any interactions between the world historians in China, even the amateur ones, with these other two fields? I realize the that Sino-foreign history of Sino-foreign relations is a field that comes up later, but there is a history of writing Chinese history from early on. So are these scholars writing world history in dialogue with these other historians, and are they incorporating, responding to, or questioning some of the narratives that other historians of other places are engaging in China? So that's my first question, is how much of interactions there is with other scholars in other history fields in China. The second question is, how much of actual relations between China and the foreign world impacts the writing of world history in China, starting from, as you pointed out, in the late Qing, that comes after the Opium War, and then there's a discourse going on about the lost civilizations or lost countries, like as a way to explain what is happening to Chinese civilization. But also the whole discourse on national humiliation that comes up during the Republican period, and then again after 1991. So how much of this discourse on China's actual interactions with foreign countries impact the writing of world history in China? So these are two different parts of this question as a broader way of writing world history, and then I'll go and moderate the questions.
Thank you very much, Tencent, for these very important questions. I think these questions, in a way, are helping me to contextualize this book project. So I thank you very much for helping me to have this opportunity. This allows me to think more and talk a little bit more. One is an issue that I'm dealing with in this book, which is an embedded theme, is professionalization. Because when we are talking about world history can mean many things. One is world historiography, right? The writing of world history. But the other is world history as a field of knowledge production, which has the responsibility of teaching and research. The rise of academic field, the rise of world history as a field of knowledge production was taking place in the world of modernization. The introduction of higher education system from the West and its transformation in China from 1916 all the way to today. The process of professionalization, on the one hand, allows historians to produce more better researched scholarly work. But on the other hand, it also limits our view of the world, which is a critique that I would like to raise in the later part of the book. That is, as professional historians, we're becoming incredibly specialized, and we're losing interest or ability or capacity to really make sense many things to the world. So it's, in a way, it's a critique. And unfortunately, what you are asking here, it falls into that critique. That is, world history in China started as a professional field of knowledge production as the teaching field. And the history of foreign relations is not necessarily covered by the so-called world historians. And so in other words, there's a gap from the design. From the original design, the people are separated up in different sphere of power. You probably want to find a job in world history that you don't do the history of foreign relations. And if you do well in foreign relations, then historians probably don't like you. So this widening gap is a theme that we can observe along with the process of professionalization and specialization of world historical development as a profession in China over the course of the long 20th century, absolutely as a trend. So there's a widening gap, allow me to say that. So this is my brief response to you. But of course, individuals, for example, Lei Haizong or He Bingsong, these people also had strong, how do we call that, inclinations to talk about international relations. And this is the place where they evolved into public intellectuals. And usually this took place in the time of national crisis. This goes along with a short answer or response to your second question. That is, in the time of national crisis, individual historians, professional historians realized, well, they have to do more. They have to temporarily give up on their professional agenda to serve the agenda of the nation, because China have to survive in the time of crisis of the Japanese invasion of China. So the change of a national environment would definitely have a certain impact on individual understanding of their responsibility. I think Hong Chang-Tai's book has talked about this, right? The question of national popular culture, right? But in a way, I see similar parallel. That is, professional historians were trying to be professional, but they would like to have a good career in the professional channels. However, the war and the crisis changed everything, and suddenly they realized they had the responsibility for the nation, and they started to pick up history as a way to mobilize the nation. to become a propaganda machine. And in doing so, professional historians, they start to talk about Sino-foreign relations. If you are interested in this topic, I would encourage you perhaps to look into Lei Haizong's writing more, because I think there's a time he was writing the daily, weekly or monthly reports on world events, and he actually has some really interesting insights about the global events. So I guess we're really looking at professional historian and this ambiguous role between their professional duties and public intellectuals. But great question. Thank you so much for bringing this up.
Thank you, Shiva. I'll take the first three questions together, which you can also see. You have sort of answered these questions during your talk, but I'll come back to some of the issues that have been asked by the first three audience members. It's about sources, right? I mean, you have mentioned a number of different sources in your talk, but in your book, you have many other sources as well. For example, you have this Liang Qichao's discourse as well in your book. So if you can talk about what kind of sources, other than textbooks and people writing on world history, did you use, let's say, journal articles and other things that are important for your studies? And part of one of the questions here asked by one of the audiences is, why does it start when it starts, the writing of world history, right? I mean, this Qing medical doctor who is writing, as you said, perhaps the first world history book. Why then? Does it have to do with new interest in the world or something else? So those are the three questions. I'm just summarizing the first three.
Thank you very much. This is a big help. And I would like to respond to the question of sources first. Yeah, I'm an intellectual historian and I do historiography, but at the same time, I'm also mindful about the social and the political process that are taking place in China. And as I already explained, and as Tencent has already reminded us, have huge impact on the writing of history. So on the one hand, I'm dealing with published sources like periodicals, newspapers, journals, later biographies and autobiographies, memoirs. These are the common sources I'm using. On the other hand, I feel sad to say this, but I did have the opportunity to get access to certain archival sources when I was writing and working on this book project, especially personnel archives, which is almost impossible today. And these personnel archives give us a unique way to understand what was going on between the state and the individual lives. So for example, I talk about this historian Lin Zhichun a lot, which I have a high respect for, I have high respect for this historian Lin Zhichun. But I also had a conversation with other scholars in China in the past. And Lin Zhichun often is considered as a so-called red professor, right? A professor who embraced historical materialism and even political ideology. But if you look at the archival sources, Lin Zhichun in the 1950s, he accepted a job in Manchuria only because he wanted to have time to do academic research. So much so, there's a war going on between China and the United States in Korea that we're familiar with. And Manchuria was the borderland. And there were air alarms all the time if there's anything took place right in the region. So people had to go to the places to hide. But then Lin Zhichun, this guy, would hide in the room, cover his window with with quills, right? And he would read, he would write, because he cherished the time to do academic research. And he, in fact, his personal archive reflects the leader of the department has a lot of problems with him, because oftentimes Lin complained, the chairperson of the department, who was a historian trained at the University of Tokyo in the past, now this guy gave up on his research, become a bureaucrat. And Lin wrote, this is bad. Everybody's becoming a bureaucrat. So in other words, these archival sources allowed us to see something that are not able to be reflected in the popular legend or personal today's biography writings and the published journal articles. And give you another example, that is, I'm looking at historian Lei Haizong, and the internal reference 内部参考 also indicates that he's being watched over all the time in the early 1950s. And he was invited to a talk in Tianjin, and the whole conversation was closely watched over and recorded and being reported to Hao Boss. So things like that, right? So I guess the question is great, because it also invites me to think about the relationship between history writing and the larger issues in society, like a social system, like political changes, like cultural trends. Historians are not just sitting there in his study or her study to do the work. They're human beings first and foremost. And in order to study them, we have to use materials as widely as possible, as effectively as possible. Thanks. So this is the question.
Yeah, this relates to one other question that's being asked is, how do we discover some less known figures who are writing on world history, right? I mean, as you look at the situation in China these days, finding some of the archival sources may be difficult, right? I mean, some people may be not publishing their writings in various kinds of book forms, but there may be their individual writings that have not been published, but they are also talking about world history, or letters exchanged between different people. You know, the most famous one was Liang Xichao with Kang Youwei, right? I mean, those were letters exchanged, and that gives us lots of insights into both these people. So how do we go about discovering more sources about a discourse that is not happening in print medium, but happening in exchange of scholarly views through letters and discussions that take place during conferences and so forth? Are there these kinds of non-published sources and people that we don't know about but play an important role in world history writing?
Oh, that's a great question. And this is something that I have to, how do I put this? That is, on the one hand, there are a lot of things that are not yet studied. On the other hand, in terms of world history in China, from what I know, there are a couple of PhD projects, postdoc projects, book manuscripts going on. So in other words, people are paying more interest to topics like this. My own book is about the ancient world history, but I can easily imagine someone writing a book about the history of Sino relations, or the relationship, the study of South Asia, Southeast Asia, as a single volume. So there's a lot of things that we can write about, we can talk about. This is one issue. And the second issue is even with the published sources, I think there's much more we can do. And in fact, I'm greatly influenced by post-colonial thinkers. When we're reading sources from the 1950s, not only we have to read against the grains, but we have to read along with the grains. In other words, we have to make ourselves ready, available, and we have to make the effort to learn these so complicated, confusing, and even boring jargons. 生产方式, right? 生产关系, 劳动创造人. These are very complex and even outdated terms, but as historians, we have to make an effort. It's not like there's nothing we can write about. Even published sources are there, and they deserve our effort. We cannot just throw the publications from the 1950s into rubbish bins. We can do much more about that. In relation to that, there are sources that are available, not necessarily in China. For example, the entire collection of the Academy of Social Sciences in Shanghai, which is the deposited library for publications of the country for many years. So the entire collection now is in Germany, and it's intact. It has all the publications from 1950s all the way to 1980s. You make the effort, you can still discover fascinating materials. So that's the second point. The third point is how to discover new materials. I think that's important as a historian and as a field researcher. Unfortunately, at this point, we cannot go back to China as people who are based in Western Europe or North America. It's very difficult. But one day, if we go back, that's important. There's a term that everybody should know, and I believe everybody knows. That is 关系. It is truly important to talk to people. It is truly important to cultivate 关系 with the circle. And I believe many people in China, they're very friendly. They're trying to help you. But of course, you have to do this slowly and strategically. So it is a physical effort. You go to archives, you go to collections, not just in China, but outside China. But it's also human effort. You have to cultivate a relationship with other people. And I think the last one is quite important.
Thank you, Xinfan. There are two sets of questions here that I'll try to bring together. The first set, which is about influences. One is PRC has its own views about history, right? I mean, you are going into that direction from the 50s onwards, but more contemporary, let's say post 2013, there's a set of views about world history, writing of world history. How does that influence present day writing of world history in China, more recent, right? The other question with influences is, Japanese scholarship has always influenced the writing of Chinese history, for example, in China, right? How has the Japanese writing on world history influenced the writing of world history in China? And I'll add to that, more recently, you have translations of world history textbooks that were written originally in the US, and that has been integrated in some school curriculum, right? So how does this field of world history that has developed, which is quite new in the US, as you know, having taught world history in the US, and it's changed from Western Civ to world history, and quickly there were lots of textbooks that were written in the US on teaching world history, and I see many of them have been translated into Chinese. So how do these influences, one from within China, the state aspect that you were already talking about, but more recently, one, the Japanese scholarship on world history, and third, more recently, the American scholarship on world history, having an impact on the study of world history as well as the teaching of world history in China?
Thanks a lot for this set of questions. Some of these questions have they urge me to think. In other words, this project is far from done. There's much more we can do together. And I would like to invite you to think about this as well. I don't really have a ready answer for you, but at the same time, maybe we can keep the conversation going. In terms of the state influence on world historical studies, there are two things I would like to mention. And this is actually something that we briefly had exchanged, me and Tencent. That is, we have to understand historians as professional beings. That is, in China, in order to get a scholarly promotion, in order to find a job, you have to apply for these state funding projects. You have to. There's no other way around. In order to keep your job, right? In order to feed your family, you have to do it. So how much this is genuine, I don't know. So we as historians, I think we should be more strategic and more resourceful when we are reading published sources. Not necessarily are they really talking about these things. Not necessarily are they truly arguing for these things. In a way, it is a sort of a collaboration, but also transformation and appropriation. So we don't want to read these world historical writings from China one-dimensional and from a flattened perspective. That's one thing. And the second thing is, I would like to remind people that is, on the one hand, the scholarship from 1950s and the maybe 1970s, in a way, is far from being remembered in China. Historical materialism has become a such boring topic. But at the same time, in terms of infrastructure, the 教研室 system, the teaching and research unit system, is still the foundation of world historical teaching and research in China. The system is still there. And the structure, the division, the way to distribute funding is still very much coming from that historical background. So in other words, there's an infrastructure. It's social infrastructure of knowledge production, and this infrastructure is deeply rooted in the 1950s. We have to recognize that. So this is the first issue. And the second issue is absolutely the Japanese influence, especially in the late Qing period. But I would really see this as, how do I put this? We can perhaps single out Japan as a source of influence, but we can also place China along with Japan as a global moment of knowledge exchange. Because for the Japanese scholars who were writing about the world history, they were not necessarily writing in a unique Japanese way. Rather, they were using Chinese vocabularies and reinventing classical traditions from a Zhou dynasty or Song dynasty, you name it. So there is a shared East Asian culture tradition that is taking a transformation in the context of a global knowledge exchange between the East and the West. So in other words, maybe we can single out Japan as a key source of influence from the perspective of language, but maybe we can also bring China in and create a bigger, broader global conversation about a knowledge transformation in the time of globalization. So that's my take on this. But specifically in terms of vocabularies, many vocabularies that we're dealing with, like 社会, 历史, right there, the Japanese translation of foreign terms, but going back to classical tradition in China, in East Asia. So again, we're really looking at this complicated global circulation and the translingual practice. The last part, the American influence. Again, I don't really want to single out America as a source of influence, because along with America, there's also Western Europe. There's Britain, there's Germany, there's Sweden, there are many countries. There are scholars who are writing in English, not necessarily based in America. But I would like to say, at least from my point of view, there's a sheer eagerness for scholars in China to translate their counterparts' work into Chinese language. And there's a key interest in global history in China. There's this big movement, not necessarily, of course, on the one hand, it's driven by the state funding, but on the other hand, by genuine scholar interest to promote global studies in China. And we can feel it, but more in China. Of course, I cannot feel it in the past 2 years because I couldn't go back. But still, from the conversation that I'm trying to keep up with, it seems that there's a genuine interest in global history in China to translate English, well, primarily English, unfortunately, primarily English literature, and primarily from the West. Less about the countries in India or Pakistan or African countries. Unfortunately, this is not the case. So that's my my thought on this. Of course, it's only opinion. I guess we're still in the fluid state of development.
Thank you, Sinfan. Just final two questions. One from the audience, and I'll end up with my question about world history and writing and teaching of world history. The audience member is asking about the role of religion in world history, especially given you mentioned Lei had classified Shang and Zhou dynasties as religious age. So what does religion play, a role does religion play in the writing of world history, if anything, right? Part of world history that we do in the US, for example, talks about these religious factors and how the spread of Christianity, Buddhism, and Islam connected the world, right? So what role does religion play in this study or writing of world history? Are people also highlighting the influence of religion in making of world history?
This is a great question. And in fact, I believe I cannot answer the question well at this point because I'm still looking into this issue. How do we understand because religion oftentimes is being presented as an argument. It is an argument, and of course, you use this argument to persuade other people. Religious writers have been practicing genres, vocabularies, and frameworks through which and by which to talk about things from many different places or different stages of time. So in other words, religion is one of the roots of world historical writing. Think about the universal history. It's very much based on the Christian church fathers, and think about the other religious tradition, so like Muslim travelers, right? They also have a very strong religious foundation, and that's something that I'm dealing with, and I'm feeling troubled with, because in China, there's a clear movement, and this movement has been going on over the course of the 20th century. That is, Chinese intellectuals, especially liberal intellectuals, oftentimes they present themselves as anti-religious, 胡适, right? A very clear example. But at the same time, they're also deeply influenced by religion. And one example in my book is historian Lei Haizong. His father was working in the local church. And Lei Haizong went to church for free, church school for free, 崇德中学. And I suspect the way in which he understood world history had something to do with his religious upbringing, but I don't have firm evidence. So that's something that I would like to invite people to do more. As historians, we just only have a very limited sources on this issue. And unfortunately, Lei Haizong just burned his diaries in the anti-racist campaign. So it's really difficult for us to return to the issue, but maybe others, right, still have records. And maybe the individual who ask about question about sources, maybe that person will find something eventually, right, that allows us to talk about the religious foundation. That's one thing. And the second thing is whether or not Chinese intellectuals are allegedly against the religion, and they have to write about it. Right? They have to adopt certain frameworks to write about history of religions, not just in China, but the world. And in fact, China is very much right in that religiously globalized world. So there's much more Chinese historians need to do and have to do. So again, unfortunately, I cannot answer this question perfectly. That's something that I'm still feeling troubled with, and I'm inviting you to do this. Maybe you can do this much better than I do. But if you do that, I would appreciate it very much.
Thank you so much, Nifan. One final question is about the state of world history in China today. Where do you see things stand with the field now, both teaching and research? And as you know, world history as a field of research is very difficult because you perhaps have to use sources from elsewhere and you have to learn a number of different languages. So where do you see that kind of training taking place in China, where world history, as you know, Chen Guangxian has talked about Asia as method, where he says the study of Asia should decolonize itself. Do you think the same applies for world history in China, and it may be true for other non-Western countries as well? Does the field of world history need to decolonize itself, or create a new kind of looking at world history? Is that kind of a thing taking place today in China? Indirectly asking, where does the field stand and where do you see it going in the future?
This is a great question. I don't know. It's really hard to predict. I'm just don't feel very comfortable to predict the future of the field. But there are a couple of things I would like to say. One is I'm hopeful because the young generations are absolutely brilliant. In the past, when I was little, I wanted to study ancient world history, and I had 2 years of ancient Greek. I had 1 semester of Latin, which is far from enough. And I got a scholarship from America, but I was rejected by the council because they told me China did not need classical studies. That's American council, right? The visa officer told me, you don't need it. But I don't think that that American visa officer will say that again today, because now the country is expanding so much, and naturally and reasonably that China is becoming more and more globalized. But that's not about the state, it's really about the individuals. Because from my interaction with junior scholars in China, it seems there's so much passion about the world history. In contrast to the study of world history in the West, I feel quite hopeful because if you look at what's happening in the United States, the state funding cut for higher education. Tencent, you worked for CUNY system in the past. I'm working for the SUNY system now, and we know what's happening, right? Basically, the state is expecting the shrinking of humanities. History department has to go, and in fact, on our campus probably will be happening. But the point here is there's little interest from the public and private sectors in world history in America, which is the richest country, the powerful country in the world. And in country, there's a genuine interest in world history among young generations in China. So I'm hopeful, but at the same time, I'm also worried because as the people in China are eager to learn about the world more, somehow they're picking up something wrong. they're picking more from the colonial legacy with a little criticism of the imperial past. That monster that is history is being introduced into China, which could have unintended consequences to these wonderful kids who are eager to study world history. So I guess on both things, right? Two happenings, right? Two trends of development. I think in the middle is the requirement, the demand, the drive for theoretical awareness. Whatever you do, you have to keep it critical. You keep your sharp mind. You have to look at things from multiple perspectives. I think that's the education NYU Shanghai should provide to students in China. That's your work to do.
Thank you so much for those encouraging words and advertisements, Xin-Fan. So I would like to thank you and the audience members for joining us today. This was our first talk this semester, and I hope, Xin-Fan, you and others could also join us in the next few talks. The next talk, as you know, is your friend as well, Tao-En, who is working on world history as well at Tsinghua University. So thank you for doing this for us from Cambridge, Xin-Fan, and all the audience members from all over the world. And I hope to see you soon again. Thank you. And
thank you very much. I learned a lot.
Bye-bye.
Bye.